I gave you last week the article by, actually it's part of a book by Zaki Abduh. I don't know, did you get a copy? It's on Muhammad Abduh. And I think if you would read it with some attention, because this will be the main discussion point next week, inshallah. In the sense that I would like this to be in the form of a dialogue rather than in the form of a lecture. So the talk today will be on the life of Muhammad Abduh. But also I'll try to introduce his thoughts and how he evolved from his early days, from his youth, through his days when he was an associate of Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani, and his role as one of the leaders of the nationalist movement in Egypt, and his subsequent attempt to reconcile himself with authority, and particularly with British rule. And in his life, you would find that there are really a number of recurrent themes. These themes, I don't want to belabor this point, but they keep on cropping up in the history of modern Islamic thought, and they have reached to this very day. Muhammad Abduh was born in 1849. His name is either pronounced Abduh or Abduh, depending on your way that you pronounce the silent H. In the Eastern Arab world, he's known as Abduh. In Egypt, he's known as Abduh. Generally, he's known in English as He was born of a family that was minor landlords in the Delta region of Egypt. His family may have been of Turkish ancestry, and his mother's family is connected to one of the Sahaba families. Please, at your leisure. Thank you. His father was a learned sheikh, but this really doesn't mean what it meant then. I mean, in those days, anybody who had a modicum of education and had certain property and had access to literacy would be considered a sheikh. He would be naturally assumed to be wise in the ways of the Sharia, and maybe even more than that he would know something about Islamic kalam, fiqh, and so on. So he was a minor sheikh, but mainly he was known as a local notable of the area. And as was traditionally common those days, the children were sent to a Kutab type school, which is where they learned the rudiments of Arabic and the Quran. In the case of Muhammad Abduh, he went off at the age of 13 to Tanta, where he started the serious study of the main Islamic sciences. In Tanta, he came under the influence of one of the leading Sufi sheikhs of the area. And he began to take on the extreme manifestations of tasawwuf. I'm talking about when he was in his 15th or 16th year. And he started practicing extreme forms of self-denial, asceticism, all these various practices associated with the more elaborate forms of tasawwuf. Until he was rescued, as it were, from this extreme direction, or this ghulu, by his maternal uncle, a man by the name of Sheikh Darwish. Now, Sheikh Darwish is a very important figure in the life of Muhammad Abduh, because he basically was his guide, was his lifelong guide. He had an enormous influence on him. The Sheikh himself was, again, a leader of one of the Sufi tariqas in Upper Egypt, the Delta, and he began to guide Muhammad Abduh away from the extreme forms of tasawwuf associated with self-denial, asceticism, doing without very long and laborious exercises and prayers and supererogatory works and so on, into a more moderate form, I would call it, of tasawwuf. And this line of being moderate, tolerant, generally accommodating, which is associated with the major Sufi tariqas, became one of the commanding themes in the character of Sheikh Muhammad Abduh. And he always had this air of gentleness about him, of serenity, of calm. He was always a person who exhibited very moderate and tolerant perspectives. Now, this moderation and tolerance, which may have been part of his inner makeup, subsequently probably led him to take certain maybe borderline positions in terms of the acceptability of certain rulings and fatwas, and may have been a contributing factor to his proclivity in that direction. In any case, he then went to the Azhar, where he, very soon after his arrival there, because of his inclination towards mystical thought, towards the masters of tasawwuf, and that he was part of the tariqah, he began to delve more into Islamic philosophy, and that is when he was introduced to Sayyid Jamaluddin Albani. We know that he attended all of the Sayyid's talks and discourses at his home. And while at Al-Azhar, he became especially adept at Islamic philosophy, particularly the works of Ibn Sina. And the works of Ibn Sina were found very greatly annotated in his library after his death. His main biographer is a man called Rashid Rada. Inshallah, we'll talk about it in the future. He confirmed that Sheikh Muhammad Abduh in his younger days, that is, we're talking about in the 20s, became a very great adept of the philosophic sciences of Islam, and they began to veer towards the interpretations of Sayyid Jamaluddin. So, falling in the orbit of the Sayyid, as it were, he, I believe, became swept, as it were, by the fervor of the Sayyid's pan-Islamic activities and his revolutionary impulses. And there was this constant tension in the life of Sheikh Muhammad Abduh between his inner state, which all record tells us veered towards, as I said, moderation, tolerance, broad-mindedness, quote-unquote, on one side, and then his association with Sayyid Jamaluddin Albani, who was a revolutionary, as you know, par excellence. He was a man of immense energy, man of action, a man who constantly wanted to see change happen immediately. He took very, very categorical stands against those who opposed him. He took very strong intellectual positions, although fluctuating, as we saw last week, but nevertheless, when he espoused them firmly. A man who was given to polemics and argumentation. And to have a person like Sheikh Muhammad Abduh as his primary disciple, as it were, is somewhat contradictory, because you'd have thought that birds of a feather flock together. But in this case, the personality of Sheikh Muhammad Abduh is probably diametrically opposed to that of the Sayyid. While the Sayyid was active, outer-oriented, revolutionary, quick to take positions, extremely violent in his confrontations, in his likes and dislikes. Muhammad Abduh was probably the opposite. A man who was broad-minded, who was fair, who was tolerant, and who could see, and this is probably one of his weaknesses, too many sides to this question. But he indisputably fell under the Sheikh's influence and began to espouse a lot of the Sayyid's positions, regarding matters of politics, theology, the anti-imperial struggle, and so on. Towards the end of the 1870s, there were 3 or 4 currents that were against the situation in Egypt, and I'll try to describe to you very, very briefly what the situation was towards the end of the 1870s. Towards the end of the 1870s, the ruler of Egypt, a man by the name of Ismail, I think we've come across his name before, began to incur very serious debts as a result of his extravagant attempts to modernize the country and as a result of his own extravagant expenses. And in the process fell under the control, as it were, of the main financiers of Western Europe, especially the bond houses of France. And while the revenues kept on falling in Egypt, there was a series of agricultural disasters. He could not keep payment on his debt. One of the consequences of that, of course, as you may know, is that he sold his share in the Suez Canal Company, which was more than half, to the British government. But in any case, because of this constant revenue shortfall, there was a big to and who in Europe about who's going to pay our interest on these bonds. And to cut a long story short, Dewi Ismail, the ruler of Egypt, was deposed by the order of the Sultan to whom he owed certain legal suzerainty, and replaced by a man called Tawfiq, who was much more accommodating, as it were, to the interests of the major powers, mainly France and Britain. Towards the end of the 1870s, because of the reassertion, as it were, of imperial control over the country, he appointed a man by the name of Nubar Pasha, who was in fact an Armenian, as Prime Minister of Egypt. And Nubar appointed a large number of European ministers, principally people who were involved in collecting the revenue directly from the Egyptian customs and passing them on to the holders of the claims and loans and bonds against Egypt. So there was the beginning of the coalescing of the national sentiment, as it were. On one side, we had the activities of Sayyid Jamaluddin against the British and against British hegemony and power in Egypt. On the other side, you had Tawfiq, who was a weak ruler under the thumb, as it were, of foreign powers. And Tawfiq was supported by the Egyptian ruling classes, who were primarily of non-Egyptian origin. They were Turks and Circassians, who again dominated all upper echelons of the power in the government and the army. So in the army especially, there was a corps of officers, Egyptian-born, mainly from peasant backgrounds, who managed to get into the army as a result of the reforms of Muhammad Ali, and saw their path to promotion and to advancement blocked by this corrupt clique of Turkish Circassian types, who were locked in with Tawfiq. So all this came to a head. Finally, under this scenario, as it were, Muhammad Abduh became swept up with the nationalist ferment, which ended up in a mutiny by a man called Arabi. I think we came across him last week. And which in turn led to the ousting of the government of Mubarak and the appointment of Arabi as the sort of military potentate in the country.
This is all against the dictates of Istanbul.
Yes, Istanbul really had a very, very weak role in this. This was mainly against the dictates of the British. When the British saw that Arabi began to seriously threaten their interests and their ability to indirectly influence events in Egypt, they invaded. And there was a famous battle at Tel el-Kabir, where the army of Arabi was very badly defeated by the British, who went on to burn Alexandria. And then that is when they began to impose direct rule on Egypt. Muhammad Abduh, because of his association, indirect association with the nationalists, although he seems to have had also access to the ruling cliques, he was swept up in the repression that followed the putting down of the Arabi rebellion, and he went off into exile and joined Sayyid Jamaluddin, who was then in Paris, and became the editor of the famous Arabic newspaper, Islamic newspaper, Al Allawi. I think we talked about that last. In the Al-Allawi, you can see again a dramatic change in the ideology of Muhammad Abduh. While he was in Egypt, he was more concerned again about Egyptian issues. He was a man who was always deeply rooted to the soil of Egypt. This is really true of most Egyptians from the countryside. They are very rooted to love of country, and they see things, they tend to see things in extremely territorial terms. He moved from the ideology of Wataniya, as it were, to a pan-Islamicism. Now, this may be due to the fact that he was editor of a pan-Islamic newspaper, but you can see that the way that he edited the paper, and the thoughts and ideas were many, say, Jamaluddin's, but he put them in the language that was really one of which he was master. He was one of the great linguists of the Arabic language of the 19th century. And he began to take on the hues of the pan-Islamic ideology. But he always had this side of him which was cautious, side of him which was accommodating, side of him which was in some ways calculating. And he always kept one ear cocked to the requirements of the government, of the potential of reaching a deal with them, the possibility of being recalled, as it were. In Paris, he broke off with Sayyid Jamaluddin. The circumstances are mysterious. It seems most commentators say that he refused to pen his name or to sign his name to a petition that was very violently anti-British and was geared against the ruler of Egypt. The ruler of Egypt was really British. Tawfiq still had sort of chief operating responsibility for the country. And there may have been secret discussions going on between Sheikh Hamad Abduh and his emissaries and Khadawi Tawfiq for his return back to Egypt. And he started changing his tune from being violently anti-British to being in some ways accommodating to the presence of the British inside Egypt. He left Paris around 1885 and went off to Beirut, where he had also a great impact. In fact, is even measured to this day. He became one of the main personages involved in the modern education of Muslims. He became in charge of something called Jamiyat al-Maqasid, and the main modern Arabic language, Islamically oriented school that was founded by the mainly Sunni community of Beirut. He became the chief educator, as it were. And this was probably the first attempt to create a modern educational alternative to the immense efforts being put by Christian missionaries, especially from France, from the UK, but mainly from the United States, to spread modern education through Christian mission schools in Lebanon and Syria. That was the year when they founded something called the Syrian Protestant College, which then became the American University of Beirut. But the Muslim community became alarmed, naturally, by the way in which the modern missionaries were attracting young people and making them really quite competent in the modern arts and sciences, but alienating them as a consequence from their own peoples. So they began the process of founding Muslim schools that were modern in their curriculum and modern in their orientation. And Sheikh Hamad Abduh was intimately involved in that during his stay in Beirut. In Beirut also, he was the center of a small group of people who examined, again, the issues relating to the restructuring of Islamic fiqh. And he began circles of mild tasawwuf, as it were, which continues to this day. He had an immense impact on the way in which fatawi were being drawn up by the Majlis al-Ifta, the Center for Religious Rulings in Beirut. And to this day, the Center in Beirut has a connection with Al-Azhar and has a connection in terms of hierarchy with Al-Azhar. Towards the end of the 1880s, he made his deal with David Tawfiq and he returned to Egypt. And in Egypt, he basically gave up politics. He gave up the anti-imperial struggle. He gave up writing articles against the British or against the ruling classes, and seems to have disavowed his earlier association with the national movement. In fact, he began to write articles, not denouncing the national movement, but accusing the nationalists and movement of being, in many ways, naive in accepting, entering into conflicts for which they were not prepared, entering into unequal battles, and thereby suffering a terrible defeat and allowing direct rule by the British in Egypt. He also started a long-term association with a man by the name of Lord Cromwell, who was the, as it were, the governor of Egypt on behalf of the British. His real name is Evelyn Baring, and you may have heard of the Baring Bank, but he was from that time. Collapsed. Sorry? Collapsed. It was one of the most important banking institutions in the 19th century for a long time. And Evelyn Baring, who then became Lord Cromwell, was in fact in Egypt charged with collecting the tax revenues for which he paid out the bondholders. Anyways, in Egypt itself, he also started, Charlie will talk about that later on today and next week, he started the whole process of re-examining the basis of the way in which fatawi or legal rulings can be used to modernize, and I use that word guardedly, modernize thought. And he started to develop his own unique brand of Islamic modernism. That, through various capacities. The most important capacity that he reached, he was head of the Dar al-Iftah, or the Center for Religious Rulings, and became Mufti of all of Egypt. Now, this doesn't mean that he was Wali Faqih. Mufti really meant that he was in charge of all the religious courts and the hierarchy of religious institutions in Egypt. But in the process, he began some very, very important innovations that opened the way subsequently for wholesale reform of the legal system in Egypt and then also in the rest of the Muslim world. His main contributions as a Mufti, I would say, is, and we still feel it today, things coming out of the Azhar, coming out of Egypt, have a certain flavor. And that flavor can, I think, directly be traced to him. Not exclusively to him, but certainly partly to him. One of the key features, as it were, of his reformed theology was the not accepting the exclusive jurisdiction of any particular madhab, any particular Islamic sect. Now, there is an old principle within the Islamic istinbat or deduction theory that it's under certain very narrow conditions, a judge or ruler can use the fiqh of some other madhab, but under very narrowly defined conditions. He took those narrow conditions and broadened them by in fact elevating the principle of, as it were, pick and choose. So many of his rulings were rulings based upon the four madrasas that were, as it were, accepted in Egypt. Then he introduced his own interpretation based on his own reading of the Quran, his own reading of the Ahadith, and in this case, just as a parenthesis, he rejected a large number of Ahadith, including those in the Sahih of the Sunnah, as not being able to withstand the test of reason. And this picking and choosing, as it were, this ability to mix and match, or this willingness to mix and match, was an important feature, as it were, of his struggle. And he played that to the hilt while he was acting out the role of the chief of the Dar al-Iftah. His official title was Mufti Diyar al-Masriya, or the Mufti of Egyptian lands.
Was he appointed by Lord Cromwell?
He wasn't appointed by Lord Cromwell. This is in fact, he had to be approved by Lord Cromwell. He had very close personal relationships with him. I mean, if anybody has read Lord Cromwell's autobiography or memoirs, there's frequent meetings between him and Muhammad Abduh. Muhammad Abduh had managed to teach himself really very good French, very good reading French. And he spent the last 20 or 30 years of his life immersed in modern or contemporary European literature, particularly French. And he had many friends amongst the European intelligentsia. A lot of them saw him sort of as an Islamic equivalent of a great reformer, not necessarily a Luther, because he didn't have this aggressiveness about him, but they all saw him positively as the way of the future for Islam. And he developed quite good relationships with some important Victorian figures, like Blount. I think we talked about a man called Wilfred Blount. Wilfred Blount was born a Catholic. He's an important figure, by the way, in the entire ideology of Pan-Islam, although a lot of people don't know his name and may dismiss him because he's an Englishman. But in fact, he died a Muslim and was buried as a Muslim here in a place called New Britain. He's, in parenthesis, Blount was the person who introduced the famous Cadets table, where they introduced Arab stallions back into Europe, and there's an entire breed of Arabian horses that can be traced back to the Cadet stallion set up by Blount. Blount was a sort of Islamophile, and I think I talked about that last week, where a lot of his work was agitation against the British, particularly the British in the Muslim world, in India, in Egypt, and against the British in Ireland. And he became close friend of both Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani and Sheikh Muhammad Abduh. And at some point he began, although he maintained this friendship, he broke off intellectually from Sheikh Muhammad Abduh, saying that he had strayed too much from the path of Islam, because Blount really was far more focused on the need, as it were, to revivify Islam from the inside, rather than through imitation of Western modes. And he wrote a book called The Future of Islam, Blount did, which is to a large extent in the form of a retort or an elaboration of Sheikh Muhammad Abduh's ideas. And in some ways it's a counterpoint, as it were. At that point, as I said, Sheikh Muhammad Abduh was beginning to veer, or not beginning to, he had already veered away from the confrontation perspective of trying to confront by uniting the Muslim world under some kind of formula, and moved into a much more introverted, much more Egyptian perspective. And as a result of his days in Beirut, when he was involved in the establishment of these modern Muslim schools, he came back to Egypt in the late 1880s, really concerned with the issue of education. And he believed that the Muslim world cannot possibly do anything against the encroachments of the West until and unless it entirely revamped its education system. And in some ways he took on the mantle of Tahtawi, we talked about some weeks ago, but under different conditions completely. Tahtawi was trying to react to a system that was new, that had just begun to interject itself into the Muslim world. Sheikh Muhammad Abduh was working in an environment which was run by the British. Egypt was not a British colony, it was a British protectorate. And it was in fact under non-Muslim rule. His attempts to, as it were, to introduce, to reinterpret aspects of the deen, to reinterpret aspects of the meaning of maslahah, of ijma', trying to push historical Islamic concepts into a Western, not into a Western frame, but into a frame that would accommodate the substance of the Western equivalent. And ijma' is not necessarily public opinion, but as we can see nowadays, there are a lot of apologists who want to explain away the validity of Islam by saying, well, we have, against public opinion, we have ijma', and counterpoised against democracy, we have shura. All of these attempts, as it were, to create concepts and meanings that are unique to a particular civilization, and try to juxtapose them with another one, and try to relate them to another set, really doesn't make much sense, but it can be traced back to the efforts of Sheikh Muhammad Abduh. He was the one who began to, not from an apologist perspective, subsequently became an apologist perspective. We'll talk about the true apologists of Islam, people like Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan, inshallah, later on. He's from a different school, but his main thrust was to insist that Islam was the religion of reason, and that the use of reason, and in order to reach certain basic injunctions regarding social organization, regarding laws, regarding human conduct and interaction, are part of the requirements of being a Muslim. And certain concepts that are or may have been considered uniquely Islamic. For example, the concept of maslahah, which is interest or public interest. It is really defined, it's found in the Maliki fiqh. Maslahah is an accepted element of Maliki fiqh. But it's maslahah in the context of particular religious sets of activities or particular religious rulings. To try to take that and to put it against or to put it in the framework of being the justification for all sets of rulings in the public interest, that kind of mental linkages or intellectual linkages are what Muhammad Abduh was all about. And in the process, by prizing open, as it were, various doors, in some ways, he opened the door for the secularization of Islam. But this secularization of Islam is also justified, according to them, by the need to enshrine reason as the guiding principle of Islamic action. So, in the process of doing these things, he obviously came into conflict with, again, 2 or 3 other centers of power. One of them is the Azhar. But the Azhar, he had enough followers so that over time, over the next 20 or 30 years, a number of his followers began to cement some of the openings that he started. And although the official madhab of the government of Egypt is Hanafi, nevertheless, his claim, as it were, that you can reach the correct rational conclusion by examining all madhabs and if necessary going and doing your own ijtihad, basically opened, as it were, the door to all kinds of innovations. So he came under attack from the conservative wing of the so-called conservative wing of the Islamic hierarchy, and he was also on bad terms with Tawfiq's successor, a man by the name of Abbas Hilmi, or Abbas Khayri Abbas, who was very close to Muhammad Abduh initially, but then broke with him, according to Abduh, because he wanted a ruling from Abduh as to the legality or legitimacy of Abbas Hilmi using waqf land, waqf property for his personal expenditures. So, if you think of Muhammad Abduh as the forerunner of a large number of schools that subsequently emerged that tried to explain away the deen of Islam in the context of reason, in the context of rationality, and that the deen of Islam is really not against modernity. On the contrary, it's very, very scientific, as in fact the only model that combines reason and revelation. If you want to trace the movement that is non-madhabi in its legalistic or legalist orientations, you go back to it. If you want to trace the attempt to link Western concepts of democracy, of public opinion, of public interest, of accountability, and so on, to specific Muslim ideas or Muslim concepts related to the organization of the Ummah, you again go back to it. He, of course, he developed his thoughts over a number of years. And of course, he owed a lot to people like Khairuddin. But the early reformers that we talked about, the early days of these lectures, were really those who tried to find mechanisms by which the current institutions or the current system of Islam can confront these alien intrusions. Sheikh Muhammad Abduh had already assumed that these institutions and the system that Islam has generated, specifically in the context of Egypt, but generally everywhere, is incapable of doing it. And therefore, it has to begin a very long process of change, of inner change, of internal change, in order to accommodate a new generation, or new generations that can see Islam in entirely different ways than their predecessors.
You mentioned that the government of Egypt was Hanafi.
Yes, the official.
The official madhab. And he took a no-madhabi approach to Islamic law. Is that in reaction to something? Is he trying to break a hold of a certain grouping over the minds of the people? In that he says, you don't only need to follow Hanafi, you can go to Maliki madhab and seek a fatwa.
Yes.
I
mean, all of this springs really from his own belief, or mild belief, as it were, that none of these Islamic schools that were formulated in the 3rd and 4th century have exclusive relevance to the modern age. In many ways, I think he was not madhabi, mainly because he did not believe in it. He did not believe in madhabs. He did not believe in the division of Islam into rigid schools. He's, of course, quite a popular figure in the Shia world. I don't know if you're aware of it, mainly because of his some comments on Nahj al-Balagha. But I don't see why he's a popular figure, but I suppose if somebody recognizes you, that's enough. And he may have, from the Shia perspective, may have been an acceptable figure because of his non-madhabi approach, because of his tolerance. And you can say that the school of Muhammad Abduh opened the way for the great Sheikh Azhar Mahmoud Shatut in the 1950s, who passed his famous judgment that the Ja'far al-Fiqh is valid for all the ibadats. He did not say the Shia, which is very careful. He said Ja'far.
Yes, how did he see Al-Asr at the time? Did he see it as just a formless body, just producing the same old type of 17th century Sheikh?
He saw the Azhar as a bastion of traditional narrow-mindedness that produces people who are hostile to the modern world and who enclose their own ideas in a very tight religious space and are incapable of formulating something that was relevant, as it were, to society. He was very acutely aware, by the way, of the division of Egypt. And this is true in Muslim world generally. The early batch of reformers were new to the West, and the West had not yet come into the heartlands, as it were. By the end of the 19th century, there was already a class of people who had gone through Western schools, who fought in Western terms, who may have Muslim names, they may be called Muhammad, Hassan, Mahmoud, and Abdul Sattar, but they fought in Western terms. They were educated in the West. They were educated in Western institutions. They were educated mainly in the language of the occupier. And this is especially true in places like India, where the ruling classes are far more familiar with the English language, their own languages. Not so much true in the East, but anyway. So there was this group of people who were Western in anything but name, and who were beginning to encroach upon the intellectual space that religion used to occupy by positing really very different ways of organization. And part of his battle is to a lot of his articles, if you read them now, inshallah, I have his collected works in Arabic, but you can read the first 2 volumes, and you can see his later writings, and after he came back to Egypt second time. They're much more geared towards seeing that class of people as the natural constituents for a reformist Islam. And this is generally true for all, has been true for all reformers since that time, in the sense that your audience is not the instinctively Muslim farmer, craftsman, person who is going to say that. Your audience are those who are positive or believe in a different value system. They can be secularists, they can be communists, they can be whatever. And this again is a theme that has emerged during the 19th century, late 19th century. Sheikh Al-Arabi is the biggest example of that trend, and continues in modern times. A lot of great Muslim thinkers are really not talking to us. They're talking to Westernized people, people who are modernized, people who do not have any deep religious belief, or this religious belief is purely on mental. So, and there, he's saying that these people who have been steeped, as it were, in Western modes of thinking, who've been steeped in the rule of science and reason, they have to be, as it were, won back into Islam. And you do that not by going back to the to sort of old verities or expounding on old systems, because these people have no way of connecting to it, no way of relating to it. What you try to do is you present Islam in a way that they can understand it, and you present it at a conceptual level that connects with their own value systems. I don't want to, I'm just giving it to you. I personally don't believe that this approach is correct, and by and large, the influence of Sheikh Al-Arabi has been more towards the undermining of Islam, particularly by allowing the state to find Islamic justifications for secular rulings. Now, he may not have wanted that, he may not have predicted that this would happen, but it did happen. And unfortunately, whatever happens in Egypt happens in the rest of the Arab world, and whatever happens in the rest of the Arab world generally moves on to other Muslim countries, or other Muslim countries have changes, it affects Egypt, and through Egypt it affects the Muslim world. So this is not an arcane discussion of a minor country that is off the beaten track. It is something to do with the way in which Muslims dig their own graves sometimes. This attempt also of trying to find justifications by personal or individual ijtihad can be traced back to him. Against that, of course, there's this entire Salafi school, which is another set of issues and problems. We'll come to that later, inshallah. But there is, I think, a continuing school of Muslim rationalists who see that Islam has to be seen in a different light, has to be reinterpreted in a different way, has to be seen as the religion of reason, and therefore, once you apply reason to the broad spectrum of human affairs, you can come up with all kinds of conclusions, all kinds of decisions and rulings and values that are not necessarily what we consider to be historically Islamic, but are valid nonetheless. So the reform, as it were, of Islam through the positivist, rationalist perspective can be traced back to it.
Towards the end of his life, he became his own being became far more spiritualized. If you see his last photographs of his last years, you'll see a person who is very benign and gentle, very calming, and I think he may have gone back to the impulses of his early youth. On Jari, I believe these are the impulses of youth, are the true ones, and they stay with you throughout your life. They may be repressed, they may be suppressed, but these are your true orientation. And his axis of orientation as a human being was towards this eclectic, this way of saying, well, everything is possible because the rahmah of Allah is everywhere. Of course, there is some doubt has been cast about his allegiance to Islam as a deen. Some people have doubted that he did his prayers regularly, although if you go back to his main biographer, Rashid Rida, he said he was scrupulous about it, so we should dismiss this. The main doubts came upon his religious beliefs from Cromwell, who said that he's basically an agnostic, does not believe. He's a rationalist who has to find a place for revelation. But otherwise, if he was living in the West, he would be a free thinker and he would have no place for religion. But he was not born in the West. He was Egyptian, he was in Azhar, an Azhari, therefore he has to find a place for religion in his system of thinking. Now, Cromwell may have read into to Abduh what he wanted to see. I cannot judge whether his religion his faith was real. All one can say is that if you compare it to, say, the burning faith of Al-Qadr, it's a different breed. But Egypt is not Algeria. What we can say about his life and his seerah is, since this is a course of ideas, not on biographies, we need to spot some. I thought that, inshallah, for the rest of the talk today, we'll spend on mainly his political thought and his theology, if you want to call it that. So we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll continue, inshallah. Yes. I mean, he had to do a deal with it. It was very bad. There was a feeling that subsequently he was quite sure that he was no longer a threat. Began to appoint him to various tribunals and various commissions and so on.
Hitler accepted in this sense, isn't it? He was an knowledgeable person there. Is it true? Can we see that?
He was the most knowledgeable.
That's why they're beginning to accept him.
Well, he certainly is very, very erudite. I mean, he was working on. He produced the first modernist tafsir, although it wasn't complete, and then he died. And if you read his Risalat al-Tawheed, which is his major theological work, it's called Risalat al-Tawheed. I think it's probably in English. He sets out the case for a rational Islam very, very well. He went into a famous debate with a man called Farah Abduh. Farah Abduh was a Lebanese Christian who became quite important in Egypt. At that point, there was a lot of migration of Syrian and Lebanese Christians from the Lebanon to Egypt, mainly to take advantage of the absence of Ottoman power. And Egypt was much more, under British rule, much more free of press. It was not really under the control so much of the Ottomans. So there was a migration of people from Lebanon to Egypt in the late 19th century. It became very important in the so-called Nahda, or the Renaissance of the Arabic language and literature. Although I think it's more of a disaster than the Nahda. So people like Farah Abduh, who was Lebanese Christian, who was very much taken in by French positivist philosophy, entered into a major debate with Muhammad Abduh. Muhammad Abduh was always getting into these debates as to whether Islam is anti-Russian. And his claim was that Islam began to close the door against reason after the silencing, as it were, of Ibn Rushd. Again, it's remarkable that 100 years later, we still have people who claim that there is no way in which you are going to reform Islam except by going back to Ibn Rushd and Mu'tazila. It's a constantly repeated theme. He, of course, took the opposite case. He did not take Anton's argument as being one of a Western philosopher, a Western person who was trying to belittle Islam. He took it as an argument of a Christian. Although Farah Abduh really was a very anti-Christian anyway. He was not particularly religious. And he made the case for Islam as a religion of reasoning versus Christianity as a religion of unreasoning. And that one of the factors behind the relative decline and demise ultimately of Christianity as a separate force to be reckoned with in the West is because of this unreason. That an unreason put a block against human progress and social progress, and the West could not advance unless it overthrew the rule of the Christian Church. However, in the process, he, I think, confused two things. One is that Islam is not like, there are no Islamic institutions that are separate from the state. The state is a Muslim state, and Muslims have no alternative sets of institutions to look for support, except their political rulers. I mean, in the West there you have a whole hierarchy of churches and other well. The Waqf is not the same as church property. The hierarchy of clerics is not the same as the ulama. So by allowing the notion, as it were, of separation of church and state to have its equivalent in the Muslim world, between mosque and state, although there's no such thing as mosque and state. This attempt to use Western concepts and try to turn Islam on its head in order to relate to the Western concepts is part of this. And in his famous debate with Abduh, he said as much by making the case that Islam is a religion of reason, Christianity is a religion of unreason. Reason had to prevail. In the West, it prevailed by separating church and state. Then, if necessary, the religious aspect of Islam can be kept traditionally, while the state can go on its ways, doing what it has to do in order to deal with the modern world, and Islam will provide it with the necessary backing. Unfortunately, in the Muslim world, this is not, for the ordinary Muslim, it's not possible because we have no source of support separate from the political authority. There is no independent political force called the Muslim clerical establishment. It doesn't exist, and there is no historical basis to it, and there is no moral basis. But of course, again, he never assumed that it could be taken to the state. But he allowed the first cleavage, as it were, between in the Muslim mind, between his role as a religiously oriented person and his role as a citizen can be separated. Although he wanted to separate it just that much, that was used by others to push it much, much further. And in the process, it opened the door for secularist thinking, as we understand it now, to become an acceptable form of dialogue. Before, it was not acceptable. I mean, it was not unacceptable. It was unheard of. It is not possible, for example, for a person to enter into debate in the Muslim world, say, 200 years ago, about whether there is a God or not. Now it is considered something that one has to prove, one has to establish certain rational or logical basis to prove it. And the arguments against it in the Muslim mind, it may not be accepted, but it's tolerable. So the introduction of alien mechanisms of thought that are outside of and have basically changed our character. They have changed the way that we perceive the world. We do not perceive the world with the same lenses as our predecessors 200 or 300 years ago. We have become hybrids. The hybrid nature of Islam has been, you can attribute it to a number of factors, one of which is the growth of rational modernist thinking that accepts nearly everything in the public sphere, and at the same time tries to limit its spiritual life to a kind of heightened awareness. So you have, again, the descendants of that, as it were. You find them a lot in Turkey, where you have very spiritually oriented civil servants and minor officials who are part of tariqas and so on. But at the same time, they allow and tolerate incredible action in the name of not necessarily promoting something, but tolerating a different sphere of activity that doesn't relate to them. In Egypt you have that too. In Egypt you have this mild Sufism that's inherent in all Azhari types, and distancing away from the state, and where they deal with the state. It's not distancing in the old days, you distance yourself and do not deal with the public sphere. Here, you distance yourself you distance your faith, as it were, from anything to say about daily political, social, and economic.
So, where did most of the impetus come from in that distancing? Did the state distance itself, or take a more active role, distancing itself from religion, or did religion have a more active role in distancing itself from the state? Which one was more active?
Well, the state, you see, began to deteriorate to the point where, what does a Muslim do in a country that's run by a non-Muslim? In the case of Egypt, which is run by which Lord Cromer, God knows who else. The state, it is not a distancing in the sense that it takes it's an active opposition. Neither is it an attempt to enforce certain alien rules on the majority of society. But it's rather to limit, as it were, the sphere of Islam to only certain recognizable areas, and thereby claiming for itself and for the intellectuals who give it the necessary legal, ethical justification, to give this group logical explanations, rational explanations, and explanations that are in some ways legitimized by Muhammad Abduh and that school, that says that if the state behaves in a way where it attempts to bring in Islam as one of the mechanisms for generating its laws and rulings, then that state is basically a good state. And you find, for example, all these city constitutions of Muslim countries that start with the constitution is based upon the Sharia. It's based on nothing on the Sharia, nothing to do with the Sharia. It's not the source of the Sharia. The source of all this legislation is not the Sharia. The source of the legislation is either Belgian commercial codes or Swiss criminal law, whatever it is, and or the accretions of rulings and laws and decrees of the colonial powers. I mean, if you go to Pakistan, which has on its name Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the entire legal system is based upon the inherited British common law practice, soon to be Islamicized, but it means has no substance. Again, I don't want to trace too much of these problems to this poor man, but in his own way, he saw fit that the role of the Muslim is to take on whatever is more advanced in a manifestly rational way, and try to find sources of legitimation for his or her behavior, for the standards of conduct of society, in the way of reinterpreting Islam. And if that requires that you become eclectic, that you don't strictly stick to a particular madhab, so be it. You do that. If it requires that you have to absorb certain formally or hitherto unacceptable positions or codes of conduct, fine. There is enough flexibility in Islam for you to do that. It's a school. I mean, it turned into a school of thought, and out of this one person or group of people, that system, as it was, spread, and then it became unrecognizable 20, 30, 50 years later. So against that trend, there was another trend evolving soon thereafter, which is the trend of the Salafists or the literalists. And in that case, all of that was really, it's not that whether modern civilization is accepted by Islam. It's whether Islam, they've inverted the equation, and they see the outer world purely in terms of what is accepted Islamically, and therefore the space that they allow for themselves has shrunk to the level where it's become practically a prison in their own worldview, which is extremely narrow. Both of these emerged at the same time, or nearly at the same time. Political Salafism, as it were, became quite an important force starting in the 1920s, I would say. And it could also owe itself to the various, not disciples of Sayyidina al-Din, but disciples of Muhammad Abduh. Some of them, like Ashidullah, broke from this overall intellectual framework without denouncing him as a person, as an individual. The other thing I want to say,
sorry, you mentioned the Salafiyya. The only frame of reference I have is the Salafi which we have, say, here sponsored by Saudi Arabia. Yes. Strict Hanbalists, literalists. Did you say he gave rise to them?
No, he didn't give rise to them. I said this was a different, at the same time, contemporaneously with this, with the rise of this, with the whole apologist movement associated with Sayyid Ahmed Khan, with the rise of moderate Islam that is non-hostile, non-threatening, associated with Muhammad Abduh, and the rise of a determinist traditionalist, not traditional, but a determinist literalist Islam, all happened at nearly the same time. And these are various reactions, as it were, to the whole phenomenon that we talked about earlier, that is the encroachment of the West. This school, there are a number of responses. I tried to explain earlier on, but probably the first response in the sense of being categorically opposed were the traditional responses of the Abduh, which is to do with the way in which these various classical tariqas viewed their role and viewed the way that they interacted with their followers and people. It was a question of arms. And then Abduh did not spend his time worrying whether Islam is for the theory of wages or is against the law. None of his business. His business was that these people were rooted, they came upon a territory that was ruled by Muslims, by the Sharia. They are not to be allowed. He fought against them. He fought against them using none of the baggage, as it were, of extreme intellectualism or revolutionary action, as it were. That was the individual response of a person like Jonathan Mahmoud. But all of these currents that we now see began to gel around the late 19th century. And the school of Muhammad Abduh may have led to what I call the school of official Islam. The official moderate, all these leaders who talk about Islam is compatible with the West, and Islam is compatible with going to the moon, Islam is this, Islam is that, and we are a religion of reason, we are a religion of action, a religion. All of that school that has seized, as it were, all of the formerly Muslim laws. I'm not talking about those that have rejected Islam as the basis of their state, like in Turkey. But nearly every Muslim country, at least the rulers try to say that they are guided by Islam, guided by Sharia. And there's a court Islam, as it were. The court Islam is the Islam of reason, of toleration, of friendliness, of expansiveness. And the head honcho, as it were, of that school is I think he'd be shocked to see what has happened to his own line of thinking. But people place their legitimacy to him. And he's a popular figure, there's no doubt about it, whatever you turn. He's seen as of course there are people who see him in different light. He's seen as a person who betrayed Sayyidina Abduh. He's seen as a person who is someone's coward, blunt, we talked about earlier, financed his defense when he was arrested by the authorities after the failure of the Arabi movement. And his lawyer, a man called Brody, saw Sheikh Abduh in jail, and I came across that document recently. And he was describing his state. He said the man had completely collapsed. He had, as a person, he had no more moral and ethical reserves. He just wanted to sort of escape from this predicament. But to sign and do anything. Now, it's not very, this is fact, right? This doesn't sound right to denounce these people after that. I'm not denouncing them, I'm just saying that this was brought to vote. And you brought this to life. But that strain, the accommodating strain, the strain that tries to become near to power, the strain that allows him to overlook certain transgressions of the state in the interest of harmony and peace and so on. The strain that allowed him to say that British rule may not necessarily be antithetical to Muslim progress. And in fact, he had supported a man called Bakhir, I'm glad he is, who made a big case, as a Shia, made a big case that Muslims can live under a non-Muslim Khalifa or Imam.
Sorry?
That you can have a Khalifa of the Muslims who is not a Muslim. Oh, yes. Well, this is a school of thought. I mean, there is no specific requirement that he be a Muslim.
Or is it a hypothetical question? Because I've got this question put as, can a Muslim pray behind a non-Muslim? Can we have a non-Muslim Imam in Salah?
So see, this is a hypothetical question, but it was implicit that no non-Muslim would want to lead us Salah before. So nobody asked these questions. It's like, what do you do when you're on the North Pole during Ramadan? Do you die of starvation? These are questions that have, they're non sequitur because they are not valid. But in this case, there was actually the thesis on this, that the Khilafah itself need not be a Khilafah. Of course, it's a minority view and it's been rejected. But I'm not saying that Abduh would have done something like this, but it was quite personal. So
he didn't capture it. Oh, okay.
He didn't say this. Again, I would like to stress that this is a course on ideas. It is. We talk about the ideas of 100 years ago, and their evolution, their subsequent evolution, or the subsequent development of ideas should not be, whether it's good or bad, should be traced to a certain origin, or should be traced to a number of origins. But the perpetrator is not necessarily the person who initiated. He is not responsible for the consequences of his action subsequent, whether his views have been used to undermine the Islamic institutions. But he allowed this. I think he wanted a hybrid situation, and we have got a hybrid situation. And hybridization is not necessarily a good thing, unless it's something that happens in an organic way, naturally.
But going back to your quote, the statement by Dr. Can a non-Muslim rule a Muslim state?
No, yes, can you have a non-Muslim Khalifa? By the way, this issue became real when the Abbasid Khilafah collapsed. Because the Khaniyah wanted to redeclare the Khilafah. They wanted to protect the Muslim faith. They wanted to protect the rights and dignities of Muslims as a political institution. So it's not something that is alien to the situation.
Was the individual trying to argue for the allowance of the rule by the non-Muslim?
No.
So to justify what was going on in Egypt at the time?
I think it wasn't hypothetical, but it came with just before it came 1906, just before the revolution which overthrew Sultan al-Hamid. So there was, the Khilafah and its various aspects and so on. We'll talk about that later, actually. I think one of the talks about Khilafah.
Sorry. When he translated he wrote a commentary on Abduh, was it on the basis that he was a teacher of Arabic? Did he believe in what was in Abduh?
Yes, I mean, if you read his commentary on Abduh, it's really quite good. Some of it's quite good, some of the best, but it's very good. And it's the first time that it's been given wide circulation in the Manshia. So, as an event, it was quite important. But he approaches from two perspectives. One perspective is language. Well, actually, three perspectives. One is to basically denigrate the theory that Najm al-Balagha was not written by Ali and Islam, it was written by Sharif al-Rabi. Actually, it was compiled by Sharif al-Rabi. And there was two strands of thought in the general Muslim world, that this is either the work of Sharif al-Rabi that is presumed was a reflection of the discourses and the lectures and sermons of the Imam, or it was in fact the Imam's discourses and sermons compiled by Sharif al-Rabi. There are those who support the allied view, as it were, who would say, no, the Sharif al-Rabi's job was to compile the same as you would assume that the Sahih al-Bukhari is not the invention of Bukhari, or that the Kafi is not the invention of Quran. So it was as compiled of, and I think he proved conclusively that it was in fact compilation rather than an invention, creation of something. So this is one aspect of it, and that's an expansion. The other thing is to do with language, because the language of Najm al-Balagha is extremely abstruse, is that the right word? Yes, abstruse. It has multiple meanings at multiple layers. And I think it's abstruse because it was said in the person in the highest station of spiritual knowledge. So necessarily it has multi-dimensional features to it. So he used his knowledge of Arabic to try to interpret how these archaic words or arcane words or sentences came together. I mean, if you read Najm al-Balagha, even I think the greatest linguists will find it difficult to understand large numbers. large number of the discourse. The other thing is that he used it as an ethical tool, as a tool to teach akhlaq, teach ethics and morality, and teach knowledge is related not only to knowledge of Allah but knowledge of the virtues, the attributes, the quality of life, good conduct, and ethics. And this was, by the way, another strain of Muhammad Abduh, is that he said that the purpose of education really is to instill in people a solid sense of ethics, a solid sense of morality, a solid sense of ethical conduct. And this again comes in the entire armory of most of the Sufi tariqas or Malik Sufis, in the sense that it is a mechanism of self-improvement and self-knowledge. And he used Najibara, or he explained the use of Najibara, primarily in terms of instilling ethics, codes of conduct, saying that here we have an example of being at the highest possible level of knowledge and awareness. He has direct knowledge of direct access to his actions.
Did he have any influence, and you said that did he study in Greek possibly?
Later on in his life, yes. Later on he was reading, when he became a heavy reader of French books, French literature. He was also in charge of the translation committee of the he was in charge of the reissuance of Arabic and Muslim classics. And that's where also he also had a sensorial side to it. He refused, for example, to allow Ibn Arabi's books to be published, Futuhat al-Makkiyya, because he was always against this pantheistic, or what he considered to be pantheistic extremism of unregulated Sufis, worship of saints and awliyas and tomb visits and so on. He also, just on another side, he also claimed that part of the demise of the Muslim world is, one, due to the intrusion of non-spiritualized people like the Turks. He was very, very much anti-Turkish. He thought that the Turks, by becoming the defenders of Islam, brought into Islam a certain rigidity of thinking, a certain unwillingness to experiment. Because these people were all martial types, fighters and so on, and they had to introduce the discipline of the barracks, as it were, onto the religion. And that with the coming of the Turks, with the ascendancy of the Turks over the Arab, Persian, or non-Turkish elements of Islam, Islam began to rigidify. Now this may be also due to the fact that he resisted or disliked the Turkish Circassian ruling class in the region. Maybe the fact that the other factor is that he probably did not want to lose relative autonomy in Egypt. He also was anti-extreme Shiites, but in the process he was certainly very violently against the Ismailis, against the extreme form of Tashayyu. And he allowed the notion of moderate Ithna Ashariya. He wrote several articles on that. He did not visit Iran, but he was visited by many Iranians who wanted some kind of assurance from him that his modernism did not extended to include moderate Ashariya. And in the process also, like that, he became a source of important fatwas to people living in India. Don't forget, India was the biggest Muslim population. So there's all kinds of delegations coming in, and important issues were raised, like can you eat meat that was not according to the Sharia for Muslims. And also, yes, it's not like Christians and Jews who are observant. Can you live in a Muslim world, in a Muslim way, in a world that was dominated by non-Muslims? Again, there are certain requirements of rules and interaction. Yes. Should non-Muslims, especially Dhimmis like Christians, be given full citizenship rights in a modern state, even though this may go against the notion of rules and decrees associated with the treatment of dhimmis? The answer is yes. You can't treat dhimmis in a Muslim state except through citizenship, equal citizenship. So, and all of these delegations, towards the end of his life, he became probably the single most important Islamic figure in the world. And there are people from South Africa, for example, who sent again a delegation to see how they should treat the anti-Indian laws that were being established by the whites against the Indians. There were anti-Indian laws, actually anti-Muslim laws in South Africa before they were anti-majority black laws in South Africa in terms of the ruling system, and whether they should do a hijrah back to India. The answer is no, and so on. So he became a source of fatwas for any person who wanted to accommodate his life without giving up his deen. This was man for all systems.
Was he, when he was giving these fatwa, was it based upon istinbat or was it based upon rationalism?
He did the following. He had a certain procedure. Next week I'll talk about it. Inshallah, the way he looked at it is that he took an issue, compared it to the rulings by that person's madhab, or that state's official madhab. But then if that wasn't sufficient, he would then compare it to the other four madhabs. If that was not sufficient, if he did not get a sufficiently conclusive ruling, he went back to the Quran Karim himself, not through any religions. And if that wasn't sufficient, or he could not find enough evidence there, he would try to trawl through the whole literature of the hadith, including those that were not considered to be sahih, to see which one has the tinge, as it were, the reason. And he produced a lot of accommodating fatwas. The most important and the most destructive fatwa, as far as I'm concerned, relates to the introduction of riba. He was the first Muslim to say that bank interest is not the same as riba. And of course the question was defined in a very narrow term. It was defined in relationship to whether the state post office bank could pay interest. And they were saying that they were giving all kinds of reasons why in order to attract money and to mobilize money and to use that money for good works and so on. But he, and in my opinion, that was the single most important destructive fatwa that he could have given, because the introduction of modern banking into the Middle East, into Muslim in general, was the beginning of the process of destruction of the economic order, of the ancient economic order. So instead, we had exchange houses that did perfectly well the job of banks, were replaced by banks. We had the system where deals were made on mutual trust and profit sharing through various mechanisms and systems. They were replaced by an interest-based system. That was much more destructive in my mind than nearly everything else, because in the process, the way in which people conducted themselves changed. And it's different if one in the past, there were a lot of abuses, of course, I'm not trying to glorify, there's no such thing as a golden past. The abuses that used to take place were limited, and their consequences were quite contained. But once you introduce modern banking in an environment that was used to different kinds of relationships, economic relationships, that was used to different kinds of transactions and so on, the entire system changes, the entire ways of thinking change. I think that's exactly what happened. As soon as that happened, there was a whole massive bank started up in Egypt, and you had really very highly organized finance capitalism coming in. Large industries came along, and there were periodic panics and periodic destruction of banks because of runs and bad loans and thefts and so on. Now, this was in the early 20th century, but the entire economic substructure of the Muslim world was based in the past on the principle of the sharing of risk rather than the principle of assured return. this might sound strange and arcane, but it is really, I mean, we're all there, whether we like it or not. We will not deal except on a short basis. We will not put our money in the bank unless they give us 10% or 5% a year. We will not deal with somebody else unless there's a whole slew of contracts and a whole army of lawyers, and so we're making sure that each one's rights are guaranteed. So introducing this notion to Muslim mind, which is not how Muslims traded with each other in a different way than they do now.
You mean specifically
Yes.
in the Middle East or
No, the whole Muslim world. I mean, I will, it's not the theme of this course, but maybe we can have a talk on the way Muslim economic ideas were undermined by Western. I'm not talking about Islamic banks, it's not this whole nonsense. I'm talking about, these are basically Abduh type institutions. They are institutions that utilize all the tools of the West, but find elaborate theological explanations why we should charge interest and bank. In the past, the way that Muslim economic life was organized and the way that people dealt with each other was based on far more intricate, far more subtle mechanisms that involved risk sharing, that involved sharing of profits, that involved the actual definition of roles in any transaction before you do the transaction. Now you don't. Now you go to a bank account, you don't just have to show them the property and they're lending you. They don't care if you go up or go down, if you go bankrupt or if you continue. They care about what is known as capital certainty. The nature of a Muslim's transaction is the recognition that tawfiq comes from Allah. It does not come from you have to do this. As a result, and this of course was changed and uses, as a result, the whole business of money lending, the whole business of exchange, the whole business of finance, took on different shapes and different forms. The last bastion of that was probably Saudi Arabia, and maybe that was in the 1940s and 50s, before the banks came in. And there you had exchange houses, which were the source of liquidity for the business. By allowing banks and by allowing finance capitalism to take place, he allowed yet another, but a far more pervasive force to come into the Middle East. Before it was a Muslim, before it was straightforward colonial powers, straightforward control over the main institutions of the state, occupying armies, and carving out economic territories to give to foreign interests. Here, he allowed Muslims to participate in this kind of business, rather than allowing Muslims to generate their own, organically, their own modern economic mechanisms of organization. Inshallah, next week I'll talk about this fatwa in particular, because